cell theory and all the different types of organelles found in cells. In this video, you're going to learn to analyze the nature of relationships between structures and their functions inside living cells. We also want to talk about how cell structures and organelles interact in a system and how each cell maintains homeostasis. Cell theory is composed of three main concepts. All living things are made up of cells. Cells are the basic unit of life. All cells come from other pre-existing cells. We will look at each three of these components separately. All right, so all living things are made up of cells. Organisms can be unicellular, which means this amoeba guy over here, he's just one cell, or they can be multicellular, meaning that they're made up of lots and lots and lots of cells. And those cells will organize themselves to form tissues, and tissue layers will organize themselves to form organs, and eventually you get enough organs together and you get an organ system. So see what I mean by cells are the basic unit of living things. They're the most basic unit of life on our planet. It's the smallest part of any organism that is still capable of doing living processes. But they're very diverse. There's two real different types of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. A prokaryotic cell, most people oftentimes will consider them more like bacteria. Their DNA is just hanging around inside of the cell. And a eukaryotic cell has a nucleus, this guy right here, that contains all of the DNA that belongs to that particular cell. Now, in order to distinguish between the two different types of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic, you have to ask yourself, the main question is, does it have a nucleus? If it does, chances are it's a eukaryote. Also, does it have membrane-bound organelles? So in this guy right here, this prokaryote, his organelles or his little functioning systems inside of there are just kind of like floating around through his body. So he doesn't have anything that's really membrane-bound, where this eukaryote, if you look, each of these little organelles are more separated and bound by a membrane. Also, prokaryotes, they divide differently. They divide through binary fission, which is they kind of just pinch off a piece of themselves. Where eukaryotes, because their DNA is contained in that nucleus, its cellular division, when it replicates itself, is far more complex. When we organize our systems here, prokaryotes, they usually just live alone. So most of these guys are unicellular, but eukaryotes can be unicellular or multicellular. We can have organisms that are a single cell big that are eukaryotic. They have a nucleus that contains their DNA. When it comes to cell walls, a cell wall is a rigid structure that gives the cell its sturdy shape. In prokaryotes, the cell wall is made of peptidoglycan, and in eukaryotes, only two main types of organisms have cell walls. They are fungi and plants. So it's only these two different types of guys there that actually have a cell wall. So when they do have a cell wall, it's made of chitin and cellulose. Organisms that have this type of cell, the only prokaryotes that most students are familiar with are bacteria, the single-celled organisms. And when it comes to eukaryotes, many things are made out of eukaryotic cells. Animals, plants, fungus, protists even. Although there are two main types of cells, the fact is all cells have these four major things. They all have some sort of genetic material, whether it's here and here, they all have cytoplasm, which is going to be the space in between all of these little dots in this particular example. And then over here, it's the same thing, the space in between all of the other little dots. And they'll also have a cellular membrane. So underneath the cell wall will be a cell membrane. And over here on the eukaryote, the cell membrane would be right here. So we'll have the wall on the outside and the membrane more tucked in on the inside. When we learn more about bacteria specifically, you'll notice that some of them will have an additional outer coating called a capsid. But for now, just know that these are the 4 items that prokaryotes and eukaryotes, all cells, have in common. Ribosomes, labeled here in green, are these little tiny little circular things, and you see them as little tiny little dots in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Now, ribosomes, they basically read genetic material and carry out protein synthesis. They link amino acids together to form those polypeptide chains we talked about earlier. So all cells have those 4 structures, but eukaryotic cells in particular have membrane-bound organelles, remember? Organelles, they're specialized structures within the cell that work together to help the cell function and do all of its amazing things. Think about it like a little mini organ with the cell working together with some main purpose for it, almost usually to make proteins. Remember, eukaryotes include complex things like animals, plants, protists, and even fungus. But we're going to focus mainly on the plant-animal type of eukaryotes. And that's why oftentimes you will see these eukaryotic cells labeled as animal cells. And it's just to note that there's a difference. It's talking about the eukaryotic cells, which are very complex, and so usually they belong to the group of organisms called animals, of which you and I are.